Today we're going to be learning Yoma Daf Mem Daled, and we started yesterday a very long Mishnah. We'll deal with part of it today, not all of it. We started with the slaughtering of the bull. To then we have the person who's with the blood, and then we have the who's mixing the blood. We said that he can't be on the Rovet Haravi'i Shebeichal. He must be outside the Heichal. And then we said he takes the machta, the kohen, and he brings it to Natal Machta Va'ala L'Rosh HaMizbeach, and he starts to separate the coals to get to the inner coals. He scoops them up and he brings them from there, right? On every day he would use a silver one, and he would move it into a gold one, right? It's a type, I'll show you, I'll pull up a picture right now. It's a type of shovel type implement, this machta. It's not exactly a pan. It's more like something cross between a pan and a shovel. See, the shovel has sides to it. Okay, here's the gold one and here's the silver one. And it was a way he would scoop them up, and then he'd be able to then he would move from one to the other, which we'll talk about today, why he moved from one to the other. And in Yom Kippur, he would just take the gold one, start with the gold one, and bring it straight to the, right, he would actually put it down, and then, he'd go from there into Kodesh Kodeshim. So the Gemara had said, right, how could it be? How could it say that he was in the Heichal? Doesn't it say V'kol adam lo yeh ba'ol moed? So how could you have the whole while the Kohen goes into and does the Ketoret in the Kodesh Kodeshim? How could someone have been in the Heichal? It's forbidden for anyone to be in the Heichal, and that comes from this pasuk, which is really going to be the basis for most of our Shiur today. Vayikra Perek Tet Zayin, pasuk Yud Zayin. It says V'chol adam lo yeh ba'ol moed v'beva'ol lechaper b'kodesh ad seito. No one can be in Ol Moed. Ol Moed is usually a term that in the parallel to Ol Moed in the temple was the Heichal. Ad Seito, until he leaves, V'chiper bado ba'ad beito ba'ad kol kahal Yisrael. And then, now the second part of the pasuk is very strange, what this has to do with anything. It then seems to say, and then he will atone for the people. Now, usually the chiper ba'ado ba'ad beito ba'al kol kahal Yisrael is really talking about the vidoy, the confession, which is not what he does right now, which is why its placement is a little bit strange in the verse. We're going to see that they're going to learn a few different things from the place, or both from the placement of it and also from those words themselves. But I'll kind of put it out there that the end of that pasuk sort of doesn't connect with the beginning of it. The Gemara will come up with some connection, but we'll get to that soon. So we're starting from Tanu Rabbanit at the bottom of Mem Gimel Amud Bet. V'chol adam lo yeh ba'ol moed. Now we're going to have a big drasha, a big braita, the classic midrash halakha, takes the pasuk, starts suggesting other things. So now it says, Yachol afilu ba'azara. You might have thought even in the azara you can't be. Talmud lomar ba'ol moed. Right? You might have thought, forget about no one can be in the sanctuary. Maybe nobody could be even in Ol Moed. Even in the Azara, the whole bigger area. Remember the different sections. We start with Ezrat Yisrael, then we move to Ezrat Kohanim, then we get to the altar, right, or the area before the altar, then we get to between the altar and the Ulam, then we get to the Ulam, which is the entrance area to the Heichal, and then we get to the Heichal. So we're going to talk about some of those areas today. That's why I reviewed. So you might have thought maybe the whole Azara is a problem. Talmud Lomar be'ol moed. Now that's why it says Ol Moed, specifically only the sanctuary. Ainli ela be'ol moed shebamidbar. But wait, if you're going to take it literally, Ol Moed was a place in the desert. It wasn't. Ol Moed was what they were talking about that happened in the desert in the Mishkan. How do you know that Shiloh ubeit olam minayin? How do you know this is also applicable when they weren't in the desert anymore and the Mishkan was in Shiloh? Or how do you know it's applicable when we get to the Beit HaMikdash? Maybe it's only Ol Moed in the time of the desert. Tosfot has a good question. He says here, what are you talking about? Every time it says Ol Moed, we parallel it to the Heichal and the temple. And why is there even a question? Tosfot's answer is less strong, but that's why I'm going to bring just his question. It's a good question, like why you'd even have to ask this question. But in any case, the answer is, obviously, it's also relevant in the temple and also in the Mishkan and Shiloh. Talmud Lomar Bakodesh. That's why it says Bakodesh. Okay, Bakodesh specifically to say any place where there's Kodesh, even in the temple, anytime it says Bivo'o, the Chaper Bakodesh, anytime he goes into some inner area that's sanctified, it's always going to be the case. Ainli ela b'shat haktara. Now this is only though when he goes to do the incense. Now it's not clear why we think that. There's two things the Kohen Gadol does inside the sanctuary, inside the Kodesh Kodeshim, the Holy of Holies. He goes in, he burns the incense, and then he sprinkles the blood toward the kaporet of the Aron. Now, it says here, so how do you know it's only when he's burning how do you know it's not only when he's burning the incense, and it's also when he puts the blood on the kaporet? Now, why we think that, it's not so clear. No one ever said K'toret, doesn't say K'toret in the Pasuk. The Gemara is going to explain later why the Braita thought that the pshat, the simple reading of the Pasuk, would be specifically only b'shat haktarat K'toret. B'shat matan damim minayin. So how do you know also when he's doing the blood? Talmud lomar bivo'o lechaper. Because it says, right, what did it say in the verse? No one can be an ol moed bivo'o lechaper b'kodesh. Now, what is atonement always? Atonement usually implies sprinkling the blood. We always talk about that. The sprinkling of the blood of the sacrifice is how we get atonement. So lechaper must include also the blood. And again, we still have to figure out where they even get that it says K'toret in the Pasuk. So we'll get to that soon. Bivo'o lechaper. Sorry. And li'ela b'knisato. Well, they're darshaning now. Well, it says bivo'o lechaper, when he goes into atone. So that would include the entering, and when he atones. But b'yitziato minayin. But how do you know that when he finishes, also no one can be in the hechal? Talmud lomar ad seito. That's why the verse tells you bivo'o lechaper b'kodesh, when he goes in, ad seito, until he leaves, so that you know it's that entire time. This Braita isn't dealing with the practicalities of this. If you were to distinguish going in, going out, maybe going in only, the whole option of distinguishing would be obviously difficult. If you're outside, you don't know what's going on inside, right? You're a few rooms away because you have to get through the ulam, through the hechal, right? Through the entranceway to the hechal, to the hechal itself. And then there's Kodesh Kodeshim, and there's also a parochet covering. So how you would know whether he finished or didn't finish or anything else would be a good question. But they're not dealing with, on the, like, what would really happen if we had distinguished. And if we had said, well, while he's doing the K'toret only and not the Damim, right? Nobody really knows what he's up to. That's a good question. But putting that aside, in any case, the conclusion is it's the entire time that he's inside until he comes out. And then you would know. So if you went inside, you would see him. You would know that he was, you would see he was still not out. Okay, next. Now we're going to get to this last part of the verse, which I told you was a little bit out of order. And in fact, according to this drasha, it's really out of place here. What do we learn from here? Kaparato kodemet lekaparat beito, kaparat beito kodemet lekaparat achav hakohanim, kaparat achav hakohanim kodemet lekaparat kol Yisrael. This is what we saw yesterday. First, he has to atone for his own sins. Then he has to atone. And this part of the verse is coming to tell you the order of what? Of the confession. Okay? Now, this is strange about the confession. The confession is saying, the confession is not what we're talking about here. He doesn't do the confession inside. So it's very odd that we're saying that this last part is talking about the confession. But what they're saying is that his confession comes first, then his family's, then everyone else's, and you learn that from the latter part of the verse. So basically, we're saying this end part of the verse doesn't really have so much to do with the beginning part almost. It sounds like it. Although in a minute, we're going to connect them, but from the Braita, it almost sounds like it's disconnected because it's talking about the confession, which is done. We already saw the par he does before, right? And then both the vidoy for him and the kohanim and the other kohanim is before. Now we have, okay, we're finished with the Braita. That's the end. Amar Mar. So now we have to deal with how did they assume that it has to do with the b'shat haktoret. So Amar Mar, ainli ela b'shat haktara. My mashma, where did they get that from? Amar Rava, v'chein amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi, v'chein amar Rabbi Elazar. Amar Kha, the pasuk says, v'chiper ba'ado u'ba'ad beito u'ba'ad kol kahal Yisrael. They learn it from these words. Now, a minute ago, we said that these words were talking about the vidoy. Now we're going to understand these words a little bit differently. And also, it's a little bit strange because a minute ago, we said these words are showing different stages. First him, then his family, then him and his family, then him and the other kohanim, then the community. Now we want to say, though, something that equates all of them. We're going to say, because it says he's going to receive atonement for himself, for his family, and for everybody else. Now, how do you do that? Each receives atonement in a different way, right? There's the par for him, there's the seir for the people, It's not the same way you receive atonement for him, right? Him and all the Kohanim are the same, but the people are done with the goat and not with the bull. So what do they say here? Ezehu kapara sheshava lo ulebeito ulachav hakohanim ulechol kahal Yisrael. Where do we see that there's kapara, atonement that's received across the board by everybody in the same manner? It's not the sacrifices because they're not the same. Hevei omer ze haktarat haktoret. It must be the incense. The incense atones also. We'll see in a minute where we get that incense atones. But we're going to assume incense atones. And the incense, he does one offering of incense for everybody. So therefore, they now explain that that's going to connect this section of the verse to what happens inside. When he goes inside, he burns the incense, as opposed to the blood. The blood he does separately. There's the blood of the par, he does first. Then he does the blood of the seir. That's not all the same. But when it comes to the incense, that's all the same. And therefore, we're going to assume that when it says he gets atonement for all of them, and there has to be something that equates them all, it must be that that's referring to the burning of the incense. And that's why the Breita thought at first that maybe we're only talking about when he burns the incense, to which they had to say, oh no, we learned it also includes matan damim, because it says b'va'od lechaper b'kodesh, and lechaper there is the blood. But the second part of the verse seems to be talking about the ketoret, and that's what we thought. Now the Gemara says, uktoret mechaperet. Where do you get the idea that incense atones for sins? The Gemara says, actually, it is the case. How do we know it's the case? Dehatane Rabbi Chananya lamanu lektoret shemechaperet sheneemar vayiten et haktoret v'yichaper al ha'am. If you remember in the Korach story, after the Korach story, there's a plague, and how do they receive atonement? Aharon takes the ketoret, and it says, right, he puts the ketoret v'yichaper al ha'am. I think it's Aaron, if I'm not mistaken, but if I remember correctly. But anyway, right, v'yikach Aharon, yeah. Kasher diber Moshe, v'nei echel hanegef ba'am, right, the plague started among the people. Vayiten et haktoret v'yichaper al ha'am. He puts the incense, and that atones for the people. So here you see incense atones. Now they say, B'tana debe Rabbi Yishmael, this appears in Zvachim, Alma ketoret mechaperet al lashon hara. Ketoret specifically atones for the sin of lashon hara, of speaking about other people. Why? Yavo davar shebechashai v'yichaper ma'aseh chashai. Lashon hara is something that's done in secret. Usually you speak about someone behind their back. You don't usually say terrible things to people in front of their faces. Maybe you would, but that's something else. Lashon hara is when you speak to somebody else about someone. So therefore, they say here, the ketoret, which is done secretly. Why is it done secretly? Because we just explained. Everybody leaves the room when you do this, right? So therefore, we're going to say that something that's done secretly is going to atone for something that's done secretly. And therefore, right, and it's also done in the heichal, as opposed to, let's say, most of the blood of the sacrifices are done outside. This is done inside, and no one can be there when you do it. So therefore, it must be atoning for lashon hara. Tnan hatam. Now we start the complicated part of today's daf. Pershim, okay, for this, the sheet will definitely help. And after the whole section, when I kind of put out the structure, there's also a chart. If you look at the second side of the page, there's a chart at the top that will be very useful to use while we learn this. Tnan hatam, it says in a Mishnah. Porshim, this is a Mishnah in Masechet Kelim, and it says, Porshim mibein ha'olam lemizbeach b'shat haktara. When you do the haktara of the ketoret, okay, now it doesn't say here which haktara, okay, we're going to assume, well, it is. I don't even say, well, assume. Well, right, we'll see in a minute, but there's two incense burnings, right? One happens on Yom Kippur in the Holy of Holies, and one happens on a daily basis, twice a day, including on Yom Kippur, in the incense mizbeach, the mizbeach hazahav, which is inside the heichal, in the sanctuary. So now it says in this Mishnah, when you do the haktara, not only do people have to leave the heichal, but porshim mibein ha'ulam lemizbeach. No one can be even in that area that leads to the ulam. Now, why is this? The assumption is that we want to keep you away from accidentally going in, right? There's a little similar, and we'll see this later if you remember, when we learned about a mavoi in Masechet Eruvin and in Shabbat. right? And the whole idea is that when you leave that mavoi, this alleyway, you might accidentally cross into Reshut Rabim because it's not clear that that you're moving into a different Reshut. That's why you put up a lechi or a korah to basically make a symbol so that you see, oh, wait, I can't go any farther. Here's the border. So likewise, when you're going ben ulam lemizbech, if you're standing right there and you're by the entranceway into the ulam, now it's true, the ulam was covered and it was a little bit different, but still there's a concern that you might not notice and you might accidentally go in. So you might not notice the boundary. So therefore, it's not only that you can't be in the hechal, also can't be ben ulam lemizbech. Amar Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar now comes and says, this Mishnah, lo shanu ela, means this Mishnah is only talking about a particular situation, not all situations. Lo shanu ela b'shat haktara de hechal. Only when the incense goes on in the hechal on a daily basis, that's the one that you need to walk away, keep away from the bein ulam lemizbech, because maybe you'll accidentally go into the hechal. But aval b'shat haktara de lefanai v'lifnim. But when the Kohen Gadol is in the Kodesh HaKodeshim, you only have to separate from the sanctuary. Why? Well, if the action's going on in the sanctuary, then you have to remove yourself another step, right? Not just in the Hechal and the Ulam, but also Bein Ulam LaMizbeach, because maybe you'll accidentally go in. But when the action is all the way inside, the worst case is if you pass the border, you'll end up in the Ulam or in the Hechal, but you're not going to end up accidentally going into the Kodesh Kodeshim. So if the point is to keep you away, it's sufficient to keep you out of, right, each one, right? The more in you are, you just need the next area. When you're in there, you need the next area. So therefore, he says this Mishnah obviously isn't referring to Yom Kippur. Okay. But this is going to raise a big problem. We're going to bring a Braita, or really his statement isn't such a problem, but this Braita is going to be a big problem. And as you can see from the chart, if you look at the chart, there's going to be certain language in the Braita, Sha'at HaKtara and Shelo B'Sha'at HaKtara, that we're going to have to define three different ways until we get to the proper conclusion to be able to fit this Braita in with the statement of Rabbi Elazar. That's going to be today's complicated part. So Mativ Rabada Ba'ava, Ba'amre Lachti, some people say he said, some people say it was just said, without a name. Rabbi Yossi Omer. Okay, so they bring a Braita. Rabbi Yossi says, Kashem sheporshim mibein ulam v'lemizbeach b'sh'at haktara, just like you can't be between the ulam and the mizbeach while you're burning the incense. Kach porshim b'shat matam par kohen Mashiach upar helem davar shel tzibur sirei avodat kochavim. The three of those are cases where normally, okay, Yom Kippur is also another example of this. Normally, the blood of the sacrifice is brought where? On the outer altar. These are what we call the chataot hapnimiyot. They're communal chatat offerings. They're when the community accidentally worships Avodah Zarah based on some incorrect teaching that maybe they thought it wasn't Avodah Zarah or something. The Parlim Davar Shel Tzibur, where the Sanhedrin teaches a certain law incorrectly and the people go and do it. We'll get to all this later. It's Masechet Horayot, and it comes up in other places. Then there's the Par Kohen HaMashiach, if the Kohen himself makes a mistake in teaching. So now, all those animals are called Chataot Pnimiyot. They're sacrifices. Everything's done differently. And the point to know for our purposes is that the blood is brought inside on the inner altar on that same Mizbach HaKtorah. The first part of this Braita, which is not the part we're going to deal with so much, but it's necessary to understand the second part, is that just like you can't be Ben Ulam LaMizbach when you do the Ktoret in the Hechal, in the sanctuary, you also, when you do the blood of those sacrifices on the altar, and basically it means any actions that are done on that Mizbeach HaZahav, everybody has to be not only outside the Hechal, the Kohen has to be there alone, and they can't even be Bein Ulam LaMizbeach. Okay, they have to really separate. Okay, they have to be basically on the other side of the altar. Now, that part so far doesn't really contradict. But now it says, the second part of the Braita, Ha ma ma'ala yesh bein ha'echal lebein ha'ulam lemizbeach. If it's all the same, that it's basically, it doesn't matter if it's, right, bein ulam lemizbeach is treated the same as the echal for these purposes. So the Braita now asks, well, when is there a difference between the ulam and the hechal on one side and the bein ulam lehechal, this area that's in between the altar and the hechal, which is outside. So because why are they assuming this? Because they know, and we're going to get to this later, that there's ma'alot of kedusha. There's different levels of sanctity in the temple in terms of areas, right? We know the Yisrael can only be in Israel. The women can only be in the Israel Nashim, right? As you get further in, then only Kohanim can go unless the Israel has a purpose to be there, and then they can also go in Israel Kohanim. Then once you get farther, right, the more closer you get to the Kodesh Kodeshim, the level of sanctity goes up. So they want to know, where is there a difference then between who can be Bein Ulam Lemizbeach and not in the Hechal? Or, right, is there a case? So Mama Allah Yesh Bein Hechal Bein Ulam Lemizbeach. So now they're going to explain what the difference is. Now, you would assume, based on Rabbi Elazar, what will we say? Well, when the Kohen is in the Kodesh Kodeshim, you don't need to separate between the Ulam and the Mizbeach. But when the Kohen is in the Echal, you do. And that would be the Ma'ala, right? That in the case when the Kohen's in the Mizbach HaZahav there, whether he's doing Matan Damim or whether he's doing Haktarat Ktoret, then he has to separate from both areas. But when the Kohen is inside the Kodesh Kodeshim, right, whether it's Matan Damim or whether it's Haktarat Ktoret, both the blood and the incense, right, then the people only need to separate from the Hechal. They don't need to separate from the Bein Ulam Lemizbech. But that's not what it says. If it had said that, we'd be in great shape. But what does it say? Ela shebehechal porshim bein b'sha'at haktara ubein shelo b'sha'at haktara. They distinguish between when the incense is going, when they're doing the incense, and when they're not doing the incense. Now, this sounds a little strange because a second ago in the Braita, we just said there's no difference between Haktarat Ktoret and Matan Damim. We just said it's all the same because Shelo B'Shat Torah, what would you be doing there? You'd be putting blood on the altar. So this line in general makes no sense, and it doesn't really make sense according. So now, since it can't be saying that, it must mean something else. So let's keep reading. So what do they assume? So let's keep reading because I stopped mid-sentence. From the Hechal, you have to separate Bein B'Shat Haktara, Bein Shelo B'Shat Torah. Whether you're doing incense or whether you're not doing incense, you still have to, which sounds like blood, right? Doing the blood. Umi bein ha'ulam ve'lemizbeach, but that extra area of separation ain't pushing ela b'shat haktara. You only need to do it while you're burning the incense. Now, this can't possibly be comparing mizbeach hazahav, right, the one in the hechal, while you're doing the incense or while you're putting the blood. And when you do the blood, you don't need to separate bein ulam lemizbeach because we just said you do. We just said, just like you separate when you do the ktoret, you also have to separate when you do the blood. And therefore, what does the Gemara assume when they ask this question, or Rav Ada, when he asked this question, Rav Ada Bar Ava? He assumes my love. 1 second. I read everything. Right. So now they say, Bish'at haktara miya parshe. What does it say here? When you're burning the incense, it seems to not distinguish inside or outside, right? Whether you're in the Kodesh Kodeshim or you're in the Hechal. It seems to say when you're doing incense versus when you're doing the blood. So therefore, he says, "My la b'sha'at haktara di lifanai v'lifnim." It sounds like what they mean is, and now you have to explain what is shat haktara, what is not shat haktara. Maybe the whole focus is not on the hechal, because the hechal we already just said, no distinction, right? No distinction between matan damim, blood, or ktoret. So it must not be referring to that. What it must be saying is, when you do the blood of lifanai v'lifnim in the Holy of Holies, you don't need to separate from bein ulam lemizbeach. But when you're burning the incense, b'shat haktara, you have to separate bein ulam lemizbeach. You have to, right? You can't be in the hechal and you can't be bein ulam lemizbeach. In which case, it goes against Rabbi Elazar. In other words, they're trying to say, if the first part didn't distinguish between the two, Toret and blood, then, and the second part did, it must be talking about something else. So if the subject of the first, which is clear, it's talking about the sanctuary, the second part must be distinguishing and talking about the Holy of Holies. In which case you get to that when the Kohen Gadol is in the Holy of Holies, there's a distinction between Haktarat Aktoret and Matan Damim. And when it comes to Haktarat Aktoret, because it's, let's say, more significant, we're going to have people even farther away. Okay? Now, that goes against Rabbi Elazar explicitly. Because again, Rabbi Elazar said explicitly, the Mishnah that said you have to separate Bein Ulam Lemizbeach was only talking about the Ktoret of every day and not the Ktoret on Yom Kippurim. So that's the first reading of this Braita, and that creates a problem. So the second reading is, Lo, Bish'at haktara dehechal. Each time we're going to switch one thing. We're going to assume that when it says Shelo B'shat haktara, it must mean Matan Damim in Kodesh HaKodeshim. And what's it comparing it to? Not when it says Bishat Haktara, it doesn't mean when you burn the incense of the Kodesh Kodeshim, because that's clearly not true. Again, according to Rabbi Elazar. So what does it mean when it says Shat Haktara? It must mean the Ktoret in the Heichal. So we're comparing kind of two extremes. We have the burning of the incense in the sanctuary, where there you're going to have to separate farther, versus the sprinkling of the blood in the Holy of Holies, where in that case, you're only going to have to separate from the Heichal. But when it comes, when it comes to the Ktoret inside, you also only have to separate to the Heichal, but they're just not mentioning that. Okay? So that's how they explain it now. So lo b'shat haktara de Heichal. But now they say, but then why would you say this in the Braita? Why would you say the main difference or the only difference between the Ulam LaMizbeach to the Heichal is what? It's that when you're doing the incense in the Heichal, you have to separate Bein Ulam LaMizbeach. And when you're doing the blood inside the Kodesh Kodeshim, you don't need to separate Bein Ulam LaMizbeach. Now, why does that make no sense to say that? Because Ihachi, hi ma ma'ala v'tu lo. It's saying that's the one difference. What, there isn't a bigger difference or another difference? There's obviously another difference. We just said it. Ha'ika ha'mala. There is another big difference. The ilu mehechal parshe. Bein b'shadak taradide. Bein b'shadak tarad lefanai v'lifnim. When it comes to the Heichal, again, if you're going to say, what's the difference? From the Heichal, you have to separate from the sanctuary. You have to leave both if you're doing the incense on the altar there, and if you're doing the incense on the inside. But between Ulam LaMizbeach, you don't have to separate when you're doing the incense in the Kodesh Kodeshim. This is very simple. It sounds a little bit complicated, but all it's saying is, if really Rabbi Elazar is right, then the biggest difference, or at least another difference, is while you're burning the incense inside, you don't have to separate from Bein Ulam LaMizbeach. That should have been listed here as well. Why'd you pick the extreme example of the Matan Damim? You should have said, even when you're burning the incense in the Kodesh Kodeshim, you don't have to be leaving the Bein Ulam LaMizbeach area. So, and it doesn't seem to be that's what it says in this Braita, because it says B'shat haktara and lo b'shat haktara. It doesn't distinguish between Shat haktara bifnim and Shat haktara b'chutz, right? You know, it's the inside Kodesh Kodeshim and in the Heichal. So it doesn't make sense to read it that way either. Okay, so, right, because again, to ilu mehechal parshi, from the Heichal, you separate bein b'shadak taradi day, bein b'shadak taradi lefanai, the daily and the Yom Kippur one. And ilu mi bein ulam lemizbech lo parshi ela b'shadak taradi Heichal, and bein ulam lemizbech, it's only when you do the burning in the Heichal. So therefore, it can't be read that way. So in the end, what's the real issue? In order to make this Braita fit, it seems a little complicated, but it's actually very simple. In order to make the Braita fit with Rabbi Elazar, what we want the Braita to say is, when is there a difference between the Ulam LaMizbeach and the Heichal? When you're doing the incense on the inside versus doing the incense in the sanctuary, right? That would be the main thing you wanted to say. So basically the Gemara says, let's reread the Braita and let's have it say that. And then it will work with Rabbi Elazar. Problem is, it says Shadak Tara and Lo B'Shadak Tara. To say that Lo B'Shadak Tara is burning incense inside, right? Until now, we've been saying it must be Matan Damim, because it's saying not when you burn the incense, and it must be the blood inside. But now they're going to say, no, HaKatani, this is the way we read it. Ela shebehechal porshim bein b'shadak tara ubein shelo b'shadak tara umibein ha'olam lemizbeach lo porshim ela b'shadak tara. Now they're leaving out a lot of important words here. But what they mean to say is that the way we should read this Braita is to basically simply say, from the Heichal, your poresh, whether it's the Shadak Tara in the Heichal or not the Shadak Tara in the Heichal, which means the Shadak Tara and Yom Kippur in the Kodesh Kodeshim. And that's when you separate from both. But Ben Ulam LaMizbeach, you're only poresh b'Shadak Tara on the Ktoret altar, but not when it's in the Kodesh Kodeshim. And then you basically change it. So if you look at the conclusion on the third thing in the chart, right, we're now going to change, instead of changing, we're still going to say, okay, if you see each time we change one thing, we started with thinking Shadak Tara was Ktoret in Kodesh Kodeshim versus Matan Damim in Kodesh Kodeshim. Then we said, no, it's Ktoret of the Hechal versus the Dam in Kodesh Kodeshim. Then we said it can't be that because you should have compared Ktoret inside and Ktoret outside. So then they said, okay, fine. That is what we're comparing. So Sharak Tara is Sharak Tara in the Hechal, and Shelo b'Sharak Tara means not when you're doing the incense in the Hechal, but when you're doing it in the Kodesh Kodeshim. And that instead of saying that last part is Matan Damim, we're going to say it's actually talking about burning the incense. To which the Gemara says, well, again, that's not the only difference. It's not only that there's a difference between burning the incense on the Mizbeach HaKtoret versus burning the incense in the Kodesh Kodeshim. Ha'ika hamala, there's another difference. De'ilu mehechal parshi ben b'kedusha didei ben b'kedusha d'lefanav v'lifni. Kedusha, they mean the sprinkling of the blood. There's another time we distinguish, because what did we say? The Matan Damim are exactly identical to the burning of the Ktoret. So why did it use the language of incense and not mention also the Matan Damim? Because again, when you're putting the blood on the inner altar in the sanctuary, then everyone has to leave also from Bein Ulam LaMizbeach. And when you're doing the blood all the way inside in the Kodesh Kodeshim, you don't have to leave Bein Ulam LaMizbeach. So that one should have been listed as well. So that doesn't really bother anyone. No, it just means it's the same. It's one and the same, because you're saying basically sanctuary, right? What's done in the Heichal and the Mizbeach HaZahav versus what's done in Kodesh Kodeshim, and it's all one and the same. It didn't need to list that separately. Okay, so from there we conclude that this really could be saying, again, it could be, it's not necessarily, but it could be saying the same thing that Rabbi Elazar said. Okay, again, it's not really the simple reading of those words, but you'd have to explain them, you could explain them that way. Now the next section is going to take two halachot that they're going to try to derive from this braita that we learned, but they're not going to succeed. Before we do that, there's one more thing. First, we're going to just mention one line and talk about something that's said in the braita. Amar Mar. Kach porshim b'shat matan par kohen Mashiach upar halem davar shel tzibur sirei avodah kochavim minalan. The braita said the same, right? Just like you use the Mizbach HaZahav for the incense and everyone has to leave. From where do we derive, right? You also have to do it when you're putting blood on the altar there. Everyone has to leave, right? Not only from the Hechal, also from Bein Ulam LaMizbeach. To which they said, Minalam, where do we get this from? Amar Rabbi Pidat, Ate kapara kapara mi Yom Kippurim. They learn it from Yom Kippurim. Just like Yom Kippurim, no one can be there, right, when he does it because he's doing atonement. Also, the blood is atonement, and it says by all these places, it actually doesn't say by all of them, but by most of them, the word kapara appears. And I guess once they learn by one, they can learn to the others, even though the word doesn't appear there. Since the word kapara appears there and kapara appears in Yom Kippurim, we can assume that what's true for one is true for the other, and we learn it from there. Okay, so now we're going to have these two halachot that we're going to try to derive that we're not going to be successful with. Amar Rava Adabar Ava, Shma mina ma'alot deoraita, v'hachi gemira lehu. What are ma'alot? This is what I said before. There's different levels of sanctity to different areas in the temple. You go up, right, as you get closer to the Kodesh Kodeshim, to the Holy of Holies. That concept must be a deoraita concept, that there's differentiation between these areas. V'hachi gemira lehu, and then, so the way the Rabbanit understands this is, then the laws about what applies to different areas is not midoraita, but it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai. We have a tradition about it. Okay, in other words, there's a concept that's midoraita, that's by Torah law, which is there's a distinction between areas. How that manifests itself is learned by tradition, not from the Torah. Now, he says we can derive this from the braita that we just learned. So why? To Isa Gadat after Rabbanan, if you were to say the distinction between different areas is only rabbinic in nature, Maishna ben ulam lemizbeach, dilma mikru va'aylu, mikula azaranami nifreshu, dilma mikru va'ayle. If there's no distinction on a Torah level between the levels of sanctity, then once we're going to say that it's not only from the Heichal, but you also need to separate from the next area, well, the next area is all one and the same. Bein ulam lemizbeach and the azara, it's all basically the azara. That's why do we call it bein ulam lemizbeach? Right? It must be because it has a higher level of sanctity from the Torah. But if it didn't have a higher level of sanctity, it was just called that, but didn't have any separate area. And the fact that we distinguish here and say you can be in the azara, but you just can't be bein ulam lemizbeach because maybe you'll end up going into the heichal. Well, if there's really no difference on a doraita level between levels of sanctity, you should be forbidden to be in the azara as well. So they say, no, that's not true. because bein ulam lemizbeach kevan de lo mafsik midi lo mincha milta. And this goes back to what I said about the mavur. Since there's no real distinction between the ulam lemizbeach and as the ulam lemizbeach goes straight into the hechal, or really into the ulam, which goes into the hechal. But since there's no real distinction, there's nothing blocking you from going in. Therefore, it's not noticeable and you might accidentally go in. But the azara, what's considered the azara? On the other side of the altar. Now, there's a big altar in the way. Remember, it's kind of, you can't really walk into, again, it sort of depends where the altar's situated. But even if the altar is situated more to the south side and not fully covering the entrance to the altar, still, when you go toward that ulam, you're going to very clearly notice a big altar there. And that's going to make it very clear that you shouldn't go into the next area. So therefore, right, so azara, there's a big altar there that's blocking your way. Mincha, milta, will be noticeable and you'll know I can't pass beyond this point. Whereas when you're between the ulam and the mizbech, we're worried that you might just go into the ulam and not realize. Now it's a little bit strange you wouldn't realize because it was covered. Remember, the ulam and the hechal are covered, whereas the other parts are outdoors. So it's a little bit strange, but still, maybe you could say that. And you could say it in other words also, which is just, you're much closer, right? It's physical. It doesn't have to do with levels of sanctity. It has to do with, are you physically closer and could you end up in there? Amarav, another thing he tries to infer from here. Shma mina, kedushat ulam vehechal chadamilti, right? Until now, we keep saying hechal and hechal includes ulam. So they say, that's obvious then. You must say, the level of sanctity of the ulam, which is that antechamber that leads to the sanctuary, we would assume it must be on the same level of sanctity. Why? If you think it's a different level of sanctity, then ulam gufa gzera, we're going to say, well, then you can't be not only in the hechal you can't be midoraita. Midorabbanan, we say, well, also you shouldn't be in the ulam because maybe you'll go into the hechal. And then we're going to say, v'nikum gnigs or gzera l'gzera, and then we're going to say, well, you also can't be between the ulam and the altar because maybe you'll go into the ulam. That's already a gzera and a gzera. We wouldn't do that. So it must be the ulam and the hechal are all one level of sanctity. And therefore, right, you can only have two things here. You can only have one main and one additional. You can't have two additional, right? You can't go into there because you might go into there. And you can't go into there because you might go into there and then you might go into there. That's already a gzera l'gzera. We don't do that. So then they say, lo, you can't prove that the ulam is the same level of sanctity as the altar because you could say it differently. I'm sorry, the ulam is the same sanctity as the hechal, as the sanctuary. No, you could say, ulam ubein ha'ulam lemizbeach chad kedushi. Like I said, you need two levels only. You can't have three. But who's to say you draw the line between bein ulam lemizbeach and the ulam? Maybe you draw the line between the hechal and then the ulam and the bein ulam lemizbeach. So maybe the ulam and the bein ulam lemizbeach are all one level of sanctity. And therefore, all of them you can't go into because you might go into the hechal, and then it's one gzera. So basically, the status of the ulam is not clear from here at all, and you can't learn that either. Now we're moving on to the b'chol yom hayach choteh b'shel kesef. Every day they would basically go to the altar where they had a pile of coals, the marach hashniah. They would put the coal, we'll get to the marachot later when we get to explaining that part of the Mishnah. You put, not today, you put that shovel into the coals, you stoke the coals, you pull them out, you pour from there into the other. If you remember also, what did we learn? That the one of silver was 4 kabim and the one of gold was 3. And according to Rabbi Yossi, the one of silver was a se'ah, which is 6 kav, and the one of gold was 3. So now you're going to take this big pile, you're going to fill up your shovel, you're going to pour it on the other one, and then some's going to fall on the floor because you have too much, right? We'll get to that soon. So right now they say, my time, why did every day they start with silver and then move to gold? Sounds a lot smarter. Stick in your shovel, take the coals and bring them straight in like they do in Yom Kippur. So they say, if you take that nice gold shovel and you put it every day into a pile of burning hot coals and you go to basically get into the bottom ones, you're going to ruin that utensil pretty, it's going to get a lot of wear and tear. So therefore, they worry, if you have these nice, beautiful golden vessels, we want to keep them well. And therefore, we're going to take care of it much better because the gold is much more fragile. So therefore, you use silver. But dafka on Yom Kippur, you use the gold one. Why? Aren't you worried about wear and tear? Well, first of all, it's only one day a year. But my time, we don't want to make the Kohen Gadol work too hard. So we're going to let him just do one and take it from there. So now we have a braita about what happens to the extra coals. Tana, nitpazru lo kav gechalim. If a whole kav of coals fall over, which is what's going to happen because you have an extra kav, mechabdam la'ama. So we sweep them into that. Do you remember there's this ama? It's like a channel on the floor that takes away all the blood. And when they wash the floors, all the water and the dirty water goes out through there and it gets dumped out of the temple, right? It's like a drain pipe. So they would put it into the ama, and that's to make sure that the kohanim don't step on it and get burned. So remember, they don't have shoes on. Tane chadakav v'tanya idach kabayim. One braita says one kav falls over, right? Overflows. Another source says two. Now, where do you get two from? That makes sense. Rabbanit, they said you go from 4 to 3. Ella hachtatane kabayim mane, but the one who says 2, where does he get that from? Lo Rabbanan v'lo Rabbi Yossi. It doesn't match any opinion. Either it's 1 because it's 4 to 3. This is very simple math, or it's 3 because Rabbi Yossi said 3 is se'ah, which is 6 kav, into a utensil that's 3 kav. So how did you get 2? We're going to have 2 answers to this question. Amar Rav Chisda. Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Broke. It's a third opinion. Titania Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Broke Omer b'shel kabayim haya machnis. He doesn't disagree about the size of the bigger one. The bigger one, the silver one, was 4. The gold one was 2, and that's how you're going to have 2 overflow. It wasn't 3; it held 2 cup. Rav Ashi Amar, different answer. Afilu tema Rabbi Yossi v'hachi kama. B'chol yom haya choteh b'shel se'ah midbarit u'ma'areh l'toch shlosha kabin Yerushalmiyot. Remember, we've seen this before. There were measurements in the desert, and there were measurements in the time of the temple. So when it comes to the time of he said a se'ah, he never said 6 kabin. They say, what is a se'ah? He was talking about a se'ah the size of the midbar, the ones in the desert, which were only 5 kabin. So then you go from 5 to 3, and that's going to have 2 overflow. Okay, next. Every day it was heavy. Today it was light. It's the kli itself, the utensil was a thicker utensil they used on every day. And on Yom Kippur, they would use a thinner one. It wasn't just one was gold, one was silver. And it wasn't that they used the same gold one. It was different. The gold one itself was thinner on Yom Kippur, again, so it would be less heavy. B'chol yom lo hayala nishtek. V'yom hayala nishtek. So nishtik, they assume, there's different opinions, but I'll show you in the picture that there was sorry, my share screen's not working. 1 second. It's a little bit slow today. The nishtik is this tabat. It was a little ring at the end. I saw somebody wrote this before about the Kohen Gadol making noise. Now, it's something strange. We all think the Kohen Gadol made noise when he went in, right? Because he was wearing his palmonim on his cloak, and the palmonim, it says there when it talks about the Kohen Gadol's clothing, they make noise so people hear him going into the Kodesh. But it's not the Kodesh Kodeshim because he wears white clothes. He doesn't wear the Kohen Gadol clothes. So he needs something else so that people can hear him going in and going out. And this ring they made to make noise, to cling, so that people would hear him when he goes in and goes out. B'chol yom, okay, this was Divrei Ben Askan. The Skan told us about this, that day it had this, right? Again, another difference between them was on Yom Kippur, it had that ring to make the noise. B'chol yom haya zahava yarok. So now we're just going to start the statement of Rav Chisda. We'll continue this tomorrow. Shiv'a zahavim. There's 7 shades of gold. There's zahav tov, good gold, zahav ofir, zahav mufaz, zahav shachut, zahav sagor, zahav parvayim. We're going to see each one of these, so I'm not going to go into it now, but we'll start with the first 2. Zahav is zahav tov. How do we know there's gold and there's good gold? Because it says in the pasuk, "Dichtivu zahav haaretz hahi tov." The gold in that land was good. That means that there's gold that isn't good. So if you say this is good, it means there's gold that isn't good. So there's zahav tov. Zahav ofir, what is that? Ta'atime ofir, came from the area called Ophir. We'll get to the other ones tomorrow. We'll continue with this line of Gemara. Have a great day, everyone.